Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out. I'm Diane Hibino. I am with the League of Women Voters of the National Capital Area. Kathy McGuire, we'd just like to recognize her. She's the president of the National Capital Area League. And just out of curiosity, how many of you are league members? Just raise your hands. Okay, and how many people are here just from the community who are interested in what's going on? Thank you for coming. Okay. How many times have you moved in your lifetime? I was just looking back and thinking myself, I counted 18 different houses. That means you have to think about it, where, the cost, and all of this takes a lot of deliberation, finding housing even for ourselves. It's a big deal that all of us go through, not just people of a certain income range. A few years ago, we visited Bhutan, and Bhutan has a development philosophy called gross national happiness. People kind of roll their eyes and wonder, what is it? But you know, it's the well-being of all its people. And it includes people's economic well-being, community vitality, and satisfactory living standards. I think that safe and affordable housing for all of us does maintain our economic well-being, our community vitality, and our living standards. So it's something that perhaps we kind of say, oh, Bhutan wants it, but I think we all should aspire to something like this. So, without further ado, we'll have Lisa.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to the organizations of the League of Women Voters of the National Capital Area for the invitation to come and participate today. I'm looking forward to hearing from our individual jurisdictions, but what I wanted to do was start us out with a little bit of regional context about why we spend time on a Saturday morning talking about housing and housing affordability. You know, why is this, why should this be a concern for all of us who care about gross national happiness or about a place that's sort of a place we want to be and a place we want our kids to be? So I want to present some background data from a regional context. And when we look at some of the challenges we face around housing affordability in our region, we really need to think about some of the reasons why we're here, because that will help us think about some of the strategies we can employ to help make the situation better. Job growth really is what fuels the demand for housing in a region, and we benefited in the post-recession from pretty strong job growth. So if you see the bars in the middle of this chart, that's the most recent recession where we lost a bunch of jobs just like the rest of the country. But in that period that starts 2010, 2011, you can see there, we had big bump ups in job growth. For a whole 18 months, we were the only metropolitan area that added any jobs in the country. So if you were a young person looking for a job out of college, where were you going? You know, you were coming here. If you were looking to make a career change or if you were without a job, the Washington area was really an attractive place for people to move because this is where we were adding jobs. Both on the government side, because that happens a lot when we have a recession and then there's a lot of government activities to help respond to the recession, but also on the private sector in companies that work with the federal government and increasingly that work with the private sector. So, you know, we have had pretty steady job growth since the recession. There was a little bit of a downturn that has brought thousands of people to the region, and that has increased the demand for housing. And, you know, it's one thing to talk about jobs fueling housing demand, but the types of jobs really matter. And it turns out that after the recession, the types of jobs that the region added were a little bit different than the jobs we had before. Specifically, we added more jobs in sectors that had lower wages. So you can see the professional and business services sector at the top. We added back 88,000 jobs. That was a lot of jobs. Those are pretty high wage jobs. The average salary for those jobs is about $82,000. Below that, though, we added a significant number of jobs in education and health services, particularly health. where the average wage is $50,000, so significantly less. We added a tremendous, for us, for our region, a tremendous number of retail jobs. Average wage is $30,000. And then we added an enormous number of jobs in the leisure and hospitality services. All those great restaurants in DC, and in Arlington, and Fairfax, and Bethesda, these are restaurant jobs. All of the any new hotels, any new jobs associated with tourism, that's in that sector. The average wage in our region was $32,000. So what is not shown here, what's not shown here? There's no federal government here. That's because we still aren't adding jobs in the federal government. The average federal government job in the Washington, D.C. region, where do you think it falls? It's up. It's 95. The average wage for a worker in the federal government in the Washington, D.C. area is over $90,000. There's a lot of reasons for that. The federal workforce is a little bit older with a little bit more experience, so there's that sort of, and there's a lot of technical jobs here in the area in the sciences and in defense and such, but we haven't added any of those very high wage jobs since the recession. We haven't had any people fired yet, right? We haven't had any major, but what is happening at the federal level is we're not backfilling jobs as people retire. Okay, so that's important because it's not just about jobs, but it's also about the types of jobs and the incomes that people have when they're looking for housing in the region. We're not building enough housing, right? So we want a robust economy and we love job growth, but it turns out that as people have been moving to the area, the pace of residential construction hasn't been enough to keep up with that demand. That red line is the long-term average construction. So across the Washington, D.C. area, which I do want to say for the data I'm showing you, the Washington, D.C. metro area is pretty big. It goes down to Spotsylvania, Stafford, out to Fauquier County and Culpeper County in Virginia. And then it includes Montgomery and Prince George's County, but also Charles and Calvert counties in Maryland. So it's a pretty big region, just to give you that perspective. But 26,000 new homes a year, both multifamily and single family, is the long-term average. And you can see in 2008 and 2009, during the recession, residential construction really dropped off. These are permits, so not to get too detailed, but just because somebody pulled a permit to build a house, doesn't mean they actually built it. And that's actually what happened a lot in 2008 and 2009. You can see that construction has increased steadily since then, but we're still not back at that long-term average. At the same time, we're adding all of these people, right? What else looks different? So the dark bars are the number of single-family homes, including townhouses that we built. The light color are the number of units in multifamily buildings, apartments, but also condominiums that we've built. And you can see that shift, right? It's pretty dramatic. It's about half and half now, where before it was about 2/3 single family and about 1/3 or 1/4 multifamily. There's been a shift in the type of housing we built, but this is really being driven more about where housing's built. Where are we seeing all the cranes for new construction? DC, Arlington, Bethesda and Silver Spring, a little bit in Alexandria. So close in urban areas is where the construction has been, primarily to meet the demand of all those young workers we talked about that came since 2010 and 2012. So while construction has been on the rise, and if you remember from Economics 101, right? So if supply increases, then prices should come down, right? All things, if demand and supply, if supply goes up, there's more of something, prices should come down. But it turns out that the supply we're getting is targeted at a very specific end of the income spectrum. So this is not at all to pick on any of these projects or any of these communities. I would love to live here. Look at that. They've got a putting, like a driving range on the top floor of this building. So it's the flats at Atlas in DC. A studio is $1,500 a month. So you need to earn, a quick math, someone do the quick math for me, $65,000 a year in order to be able to afford to rent a studio, a 300, 400, 500 square foot studio apartment, which when we talk about housing affordability, we usually talk about it in terms of spending 30% of your income every month on housing. That's the general standard, and many of you may be familiar with that standard, but when you spend 30% of your income on housing, maybe think about how much money you've spent on housing in different times of your life, but if you spend 30% of your income on housing, you're supposed to then have enough left over for everything else. Healthcare, transportation, food, saving for education maybe. There's research that suggests that people who spend more than 30% of their income on housing spend less on food and less on healthcare, which is really troubling. Like, you can imagine similar people, otherwise similar, except one person spends more than 30% of their income on housing. They spend less on healthcare. So that's why we use that 30% rule. So this is a property that's in that sort of increase in new construction, but it's really targeting one part of the market. This is Bainbridge, Bethesda. If you want a one-bedroom, $2,200 a month to rent in a fabulous building with a fabulous kitchen. I'm jealous of the kitchen there. And so it is, and there is demand for this type of housing from some of the folks that we talked about who are coming here and some people who have lived here, both young people and maybe people looking to downsize, people who are at the ends of their career and have a little more disposable income. So there certainly has been demand. There hasn't been a lot of new homeownership construction since the recession, although that's changing. One major, I mean, there's obviously examples around the region, but one major development is Potomac Yard in Alexandria. Is anyone here from Alexandria? I know we don't have representation from the league in Alexandria, but this is my hometown, so this is Potomac Yard, and there are thousands of new homes that have been built in Potomac Yard that are homeownership, condominium and townhouses. And a 3-bedroom home is nearly $900,000. Again, really targeting one end of the market. That's not to say that these are great products and there's demand for that, but even when we've been increasing construction, we're still only targeting one part of the need, which means that the challenge, the housing affordability challenge for people who don't make a lot of money is actually becoming much worse. So we talk about that share of people who spend more than 30% of their income on housing. Metro-wide, back in 2000, about 35% of renters spent more than 30% of their income on housing, about 35%. So there's always been folks for whom finding affordable housing is a challenge. In 2015, almost half, so think of all the renters you might know, almost half of renters in the Washington, D.C. area are so-called housing cost burdened, spending more on housing, leaving less for other things. And you can see across the jurisdictions that share of renters that are cost burdened has increased between 2000 and 2015 across the board. And so there are now thousands and thousands of more households who are cost burdened in the Washington, D.C. area. Just to bring that home a little bit more specifically, this is an example specifically for Fairfax County, but and the panelists will be able to chime in. $1,700 a month on average is probably typical for some of our other communities. You need to make $70,000 in order to afford the typical rent in Fairfax County. These are some of the starting salaries for the public sector workers in Fairfax County. These are data from Fairfax County. So this is $47,000 for a teacher. Based on Fairfax County's analysis, someone would have to be in the school system for 11 years and get raises each year in order to earn enough to afford the typical apartment in Fairfax County. Police officer, a public health nurse. So these are the public service employees that serve the community, and by and large, many of them earn salaries that make it really challenging to afford to rent. This is rent. This isn't even home ownership, to rent a place. Even across the private sector, though. So this is data from the National Housing Conference's Paycheck to Paycheck survey, and it is for the Washington metropolitan area. Do you remember how much you needed? You needed $70,000 to rent the typical apartment. Retail salesperson, graphic designer, security guard, accountant, medical records transcriptionist, people who serve the economy. None of these folks, these are average salaries, so these are people mid-career, make enough money in order to afford the typical apartment. So why do we care, right? Why should we care? Particularly if our family's doing okay, we're doing okay, why should we care? Well, there's a lot of reasons why we might care. it turns out that we know from research and from anecdote that housing really serves a lot of benefits. And having access to safe housing, or to affordable housing, stable housing in safe neighborhoods actually has benefits that accrue beyond the person who lives in that home. Now, there is research on how housing benefits individual and family well-being, but there's also evidence about how a sufficient supply of housing really builds inclusive communities and strong economies. So I want to go through those just briefly, one by one, just so we can sort of understand what they might mean. There is research out there that consistently shows that when kids have access to stable housing and their parents have access to housing they can afford, they go to school more regularly and their academic performance improves. And that makes sense, right? If you're moving around a lot from school to school, it's really hard to stay up on your classes. If you have a safe space where you have a little space to do your homework that's unimpeded by overcrowded situations or by worrying about your safe neighborhood, you do better in school. I think that sounds logical to us, but for me as a researcher, the fact that someone's gone out and collected data to show this makes me even feel like it's more important for us to talk about that. Research has also shown that when people live in stable, affordable housing in safe neighborhoods, they have better physical health, they have better mental health, and there is lower levels of stress among parents. I have a 2-year-old, so there's enough stress already, right? So you don't need anything else to add to that stress, and having access to this kind of housing reduces that. Really interesting research has come out lately that shows that if you live in a place that is in a neighborhood that connects you to opportunities, good jobs, to transit, to amenities, your kids have faster economic upward mobility than other kids. And if you care about that, great. And if you care about the bottom line, they end up paying more in taxes when they're adults. They get better jobs and they pay more taxes. And so the neighborhoods that kids live in when they're young actually ends up making them, by one measure, a more productive citizen in terms of the amount they contribute back in taxes. So there's lots of reasons to care for the families themselves. When you provide housing that's affordable and appropriate for individuals in all phases of life and from all backgrounds, you end up being a place where there's more equitable access to opportunities, no matter what your background was, no matter what your parents' income happened to be, no matter your race, no matter your culture. And the sustainability then of these communities is so important because when we learn from other people and from people who have a diversity of interests and assets, we end up having more sustainable communities and more diverse communities. And finally, we know from data that when you have housing that can be affordable and attainable to workers, it allows them to both live and work in the community in which they are. So if you have a job in a place and you can live closer to a place, that's actually a benefit to you, of course, but it's also a benefit to all of us because there's shorter commutes, there's less traffic congestion, there's less people coming in and out of different jurisdictions if people can both live and work in the community. It also makes it easier for businesses to retain and attract workers. This is really important for our region moving forward. I'm sure you all have heard that there is significant risk to our local economy if some of the budget cuts that are proposed go through, in terms of declining in the federal workforce, suggesting really a need to bolster our private sector employment, to bring jobs here that don't have any tie to the federal government, because the federal government's in a little precarious situation right now, from our local economy perspective, and maybe from other perspectives, but we're not going to go down that road. We're just talking about the issue. So it turns out that if you have an adequate supply of housing in great neighborhoods that's affordable to workers, businesses want to be there because that's what their workers want. And so if we don't have it here, but it's available in Austin or Portland or Boston, then businesses aren't going to locate here, they're going to locate elsewhere. And that has an impact on our regional economy. Finally, there's also, again, really interesting research that shows when you look across regions across the country, regions that have less income segregation, okay, regions that have more neighborhoods where people from all economic backgrounds live, those regions have greater economic growth and economic sustainability. So more economic integration, better economic growth. More economic segregation, where housing for people with lower incomes is put in one place and housing for higher income people is put in another place. Those places grow more slowly economically. And that seems important for us to keep in mind. So great, this is all, we all know this. Why aren't we building this housing then, right? It seems so obvious. And it turns out that there's a few reasons why we're not building, sort of obvious reasons we're not building a sufficient supply of housing affordable to low and moderate income families. Land is expensive here. It's an attractive place to be. There's only so much of it. We're not producing any more of it. And so anytime you want to build somewhere, the cost of land is a big factor. And so if land is expensive, what you put on it has to be rented or sold at a high price to make up for that very high cost of land. So we can't do anything about that in some ways, although we can come back to that. But state and local regulations are another factor that is related to why we're not building A, more housing, or B, more perhaps smaller housing that may be more affordable to people at lower and moderate incomes. And I'm sure we'll talk more about how zoning affects the supply of housing. But I've become increasingly interested in this last bullet, and that's why I'm so glad we're talking today. It feels to me, the more that I get to talk with folks at the local level, both here in the Washington area and other places, that community opposition to new development is probably one of the biggest factors in limiting the amount of new housing construction in many places. Not here, maybe not here particularly, you can tell me what you think, but certainly here and in other places. There is a very robust community engagement process in most of our communities here in the Washington, D.C. area around proposals for new development, and that's a good thing. But what happens is sometimes there's, in some communities, again, not specifically here perhaps, we can talk more about it, but this rise of hyper-localism, have you heard of this? That people come out and their vision is about their block or their street, not about their community, and for goodness sake, not about the whole region, right? It's about their block. And so because there's a lot of pressure to really listen to constituents, elected officials feel like that, this is where the attention is coming from about these people who oppose particular specific projects in specific neighborhoods on specific blocks, which then, if you do that over and over again, you end up not producing as much housing. And so we need more people to stand up and say yes instead of no. And so that's, I'm hoping that we can think about how that plays out. On the cost front, because that, why can't we build to housing that's more affordable? This is an example that is just, the numbers are just illustrative, but it costs a lot to build housing, and the little house on the left, that bar in black shows the gap between how much it costs to build the housing and how much the person who built it would get if they charged rents affordable to extremely low-income people. So if they wanted to build an apartment building where they rented it to people with extremely low incomes, they would lose that much money. And nobody wants to lose that much money. No one's going to build if they're losing that much money. On the right, it shows how a program called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which is a program that provides financing for affordable housing projects, can help to close that gap. But there's still a gap. And so someone still might not be able to build this project. And so that's why there's a need for multiple sources of funding, and there's from the public sector, and perhaps also changes related to land use and zoning to help make the numbers sort of pencil out to build to people who make less money. So I mentioned the financing and the gap, and we're going to hear from our local jurisdictions about what they're doing in their communities, because there's a lot going on here in the Washington area. But in my mind, there's kind of three areas. And this is how we organized it in Arlington, now that I'm looking at it, Arlington's plan. Three areas of potential ways local communities can work to expand housing options for people at lower incomes. Some are related to land use and zoning. Some are financial, so this is money, right, public money. And then some are related to services to help people access housing or stay in their housing. And of course, these all intersect here. And we're going to talk about some of these programs and policies over the course of the day. So I don't want to go into them in too much detail, but there are lots of things the local communities around here are doing that fall in each of these buckets that are designed to help expand housing options for people at lower incomes. The main point of showing this is there's no one tool. So if you hear something and you're like, well, I just need to go out and become an advocate for that, and that's going to solve our problem, and we can be done with this conversation. There's no tool. But we're going to learn today, later this morning, and also this afternoon. But sometimes the tools come up one at a time, and they're up for debate. I think we have time for a couple of questions before we go to the panel, but just to leave with some thoughts. The federal funding has never been sufficient to meet the needs of people who have low incomes, to meet housing needs. There are a lot of programs run by the federal government designed to help people who have lower incomes that are entitlement programs. If you meet the requirements for food stamps, you go sign up for food stamps and you get food stamps. If you meet the requirements for Medicaid, you go and sign up for Medicaid and you get Medicaid. The program rules might change, but the eligibility is laid out. You go find out if you meet it, and then you get that benefit. That's not true with federal housing subsidies. There's a whole set of eligibility requirements for getting help with housing, but there's an insufficient amount of resources to meet the need. And only about 1 in 4 eligible households in America receive some type of assistance from the federal government. So if you think about all the folks who might need assistance, a lot are being left out. And then there's cuts proposed to the federal budget. And so HUD and President Trump budget, President, I still can't even say those two words together, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I am not, no, and that's not like me. President Trump's budget cuts HUD by about 13%, so $6 billion. So this means that the people who are served now might continue to be served or might not. But importantly, remember those gaps we saw in how to make it affordable? Those gaps are filled sometimes by federal sources like CDBG and HOME and from other. That money is being zeroed out in the federal budget. So those gaps won't be filled by that. They'll have to be filled somewhere else if we're going to build that housing. What that means, but this decline in federal resources has been going on for a while. By some measures, and it's been necessitating more investment on the part of the local communities, and we're feeling that here in the Washington area at the local level, needing more resources, more innovation, more creativity in terms of using the land that we have, because the resources from the federal government are not going to solve our problem. It hasn't to date, and it's certainly not going to in the future. We're increasingly understanding the importance of regional cooperation on this issue. When we think of Metro, could you imagine if it was only Arlington worrying about Metro, or if it was only DC worrying about Metro, or only Montgomery County or Prince George's County worrying about Metro? That doesn't make any sense, right? The red line goes right Montgomery County into DC, right? But we don't think about that with housing. But every day, people commute from one place to another, live and work in places, and the region doesn't think about housing in the same way that they think about transportation. But I think that's changing. The Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, a new group, relatively new group called the Housing Leaders Group, is really thinking about what the region might be able to do as a collective. And then finally, I'll just end, the support of local residents can't be overstated, I don't think. For those of you who go to public meetings, there is my sense, at least, that the elected officials really listen to people who get up in front of a mic at a public meeting and say and state their opinion. And so getting more people to say yes instead of no to specific policy recommendations, to specific projects, I feel like is a critical step to being able to ensure that we can meet those future housing needs moving forward.